Thank you so much. It's such a thrill and an honour to be here, and so many, many thanks to Elizabeth and Ursula for inviting me. And I do indeed straddle two disciplines, which basically is the sort of the bit in between, actually, of the things I think that we all think about every day but don't necessarily see in one view, one vision. And that sort of coming together is with, as Elizabeth said in her introduction, between food and cities. And I studied architecture for many years, and I taught it, and I was teaching urban design, and the subject of food never came up. And it was a big revelation to me when I realised that actually the feeding of cities was arguably the engine shaping civilization. Now, today, because we're talking about food and power at this conference, I'm going to talk to you about two wonderful European cities, Paris and London, because they have very interesting, contrasting histories, which I think tell us a huge amount, not just about the hidden forces shaping our lives, but also about the dilemmas we face now and where we might go with them. So, before I start talking about them, I'm going to really talk about cities in general, the problem of how you feed a city. I don't know how many of you know this image. In fact, I'd just be quite interested if you could put your hands up if you do. Quite a foodie audience. Okay, so that's very high, given the general population. So that's about a fifth of you. Anyway, it's my favourite image, and it's called, as you can see, The Allegory of the Effects of Good Government. And this is not an accidental title, and I'll come back to it. But basically, when I was an architecture student, I went to see this image in Siena, and I remember looking at it and thinking, well, that's a lovely image of Siena. And in fact, if you, this actually, I should say, sits on one side of the town hall in Siena, and the image is probably about as big as this entire wall, something like that. It's very, very large. And if you look out of the window of the town hall, in fact, you see a landscape that still looks very much like this. In other words, it's basically a very cultivated, artificial landscape, deliberately created to feed the city. And what's extraordinary to me when I first saw this image all those years ago, it didn't strike me that it had anything to do with food. I just saw a city and a landscape. But if you look at it more closely, you can see that this wall, which is a slightly odd kind of visual device, appears to be dividing the image in two, is actually not a wall, it's a membrane, and through it are passing all sorts of things constantly. Huntsmen leaving to go and maybe shoot a deer or something, a pig walking into the city, asses coming with grain on their backs, and a whole road stretching right out to the coast. And then inside, a flock of sheep wandering around, a woman with a basket of eggs on her head, more asses coming into the city. Sorry? Can't hear. Okay, oh, sorry. This is why we were going to have this thing. How much did you miss? Okay. Lots of stuff going on. Well, that was easy. No. It's all about food, essentially. But why didn't I see that when I came and saw it when I was a young architecture student? And that's really my question. So that's thing one. Thing two is the fact that this relationship between the city and the countryside, that Lorenzetti image is all about, still exists, but it's invisible. Why is it invisible? Because, of course, we can't look out of the window now and see the landscapes that feed us anymore. Indeed, the landscapes that feed us are often thousands of miles away, and they're not necessarily the kinds of landscapes that you would choose to paint, even if you could. So we've got a really weird situation that I call the urban paradox. It's a paradox because we think of ourselves as urban. I mean, I don't know how many times you've opened a newspaper. Well, nobody opens newspapers anymore, do they? Sorry. Anyway, you've read a tweet online or read something online talking about how humanity is now urban and, you know, we're entering the urban age and there's more people living in cities than in the countryside and so on. Yeah, well, that's all great. But actually, if you think of, I like to use Aristotle's term, Aristotle calls us political animals. And the beautiful thing about this term is that it tells you that there's an inherent duality about being human. So as an architect, obviously, I worry about how we live and the kinds of spaces we build for ourselves to live in. Because we're political, this means we're social, which means we need each other, which means it's really lovely to see you all here at 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning listening to me. It'd be a bit tragic if I was on my own. But on the other hand, we're animals. And what does that mean? That means that we need the natural world to sustain us. And these are conflicting needs. And that is the urban paradox in a nutshell. And it's called a paradox because there's no ideal solution to it. Now, of course, we didn't all live in cities. In fact, for most of human history, we didn't stay in one place, actually. We followed the food around. And this was a wonderful image by Rubens of life in what would effectively have been, well, it was obviously the Garden of Eden, but that was, in fact, an area of ancient Mesopotamia, we think. It shows that eating has always been political, even before cities were built, because basically, well, we know what happens when Eve offers Adam an apple. So the question of who feeds who is also always bound up in the question of how to eat. But more fundamentally, before cities, actually, people pretty much fed themselves, so they lived in small bands, they followed the food around, they kind of lived in the larder, if you like, would be a shorthand way of describing how humans fed themselves. That didn't last. In fact, the first great upheaval of that way of life came after a climate crisis called the end of the last ice age. The forest that people had lived in started to recede northwards. The world was heating up, there were a lot more people around, and they were running out of food. And over a long period of experimentation, they came up with this radical new idea of basically not only eating grain, which had been done before, but also saving the seeds, planting it, and ultimately settling next to the food. So really, the big difference between farming to feed yourself and hunting and foraging to feed yourself is that you stay in one place, because once you've invested in a piece of land, you stick around. So these early settlements were partly fed by farming and partly still fed by trading and hunter-gathering, but eventually you get this group of settlements down here which were very emphatically farming communities, and in fact they're the first group that archaeologists all agree are complex enough to be called cities. So there are various things to understand from this co-evolution of agriculture and urbanity, but the key one really is that grain is the food of cities, and it's the only one we've yet discovered capable of feeding large, static, non-food producing populations. So what were those early cities like? Well, here's one of them. It's the city of Ur, that little group I just pointed out, and we immediately notice certain things about it. The first thing we notice is that it's very small. That's about something like 0.5 kilometre across. It's very dense, so that is representative of the structure of the city. It's tiny little houses with barely any open space between them. It's on a river, in this case the Euphrates, and it's surrounded by farmland. And notably as well, it's dominated by this large temple complex. You might have seen American helicopters landing on that during the Iraq War. But this is where the gods lived, basically. And the temple, interestingly, was not only the spiritual centre of the city, but also the administrative centre. And here we get the first signs of what farming is going to do to us as political animals. It's going to give us hierarchy. So no longer are we all just feeding ourselves, but actually the temple is in control. And in fact, a lot of the people working the land were slaves. So we immediately get an emergence of a sort of, as I say, a hierarchy to do with who gets fed and who doesn't get fed and who feeds. But more interestingly, this temple was actually the administrative centre, which organised the harvest for the whole city, gathered the grain, offered it up to the gods in the temple, stored it in the temple granary, baked it in the temple bakeries, and then redistributed it to the city during the course of the year. So in modern terminology, if we were going to say how did the world's first city feed themselves, we would say that they were city-states, which means they're a blob of urbanity surrounded by farmland, dominated by what we would now probably call a large spiritualised food distribution centre. Doesn't sound very glamorous, does it? But anyway, it's much more interesting than that. But anyway, nevertheless, we must press on. Most cities followed this model because it made a lot of sense. But not all of them did. Rome famously was the first city to have more than 1 million citizens by the 1st century AD. So just to wake you up after breakfast and give me a chance to get my water, does anyone have any idea how it would have fed itself? Sorry? Okay, I'll take that because you're talking about food miles basically, which is my point. Yes, thank you. Food miles. Sorry? Exactly. Exactly right. Exactly right. Over the water is the key to this. Over water. So here's Rome, and here is its food basket. And it's really quite extraordinary. The only way a city the size of Rome could have fed itself was over the sea. It was about 50 times cheaper to feed yourself over water than over land. There's a very interesting study done by Robert Morley. Not Robert Morley, somebody Morley, sorry, which shows that Neville Morley, this is what I'm like in the morning. Basically, it shows that it would have been more expensive to bring grain in. So the thing about grain is it's not only the most important food of the city, but it's also very heavy and bulky in relation to its value. So after about a space of 20 or 30 miles, it was basically economically unviable to bring it in. And if you imagine carrying enough grain on the backs of wagons dragged by oxen to feed 1 million people with bread every day, not a great idea. So Rome sequentially defeated Sicily, Sardinia, North Africa, which one of you mentioned quite correctly, and then very, very famously Egypt, which became the bread basket of Rome. The Alexandrian grain ships were the supertankers of their day. And in fact, I mean, one could go on about how Rome fed itself at great length with great interest because it was the first city to really face many of the problems we face now. It was fed in on what we would now call a just-in-time basis. There was only ever enough food for a couple of weeks in the city. In fact, the shipping in the Mediterranean was artificially subsidised to keep it running smoothly. And the Emperor Tiberius said, and I shall quote him directly, because I managed to print him out, he said, "The duty of feeding the people, senators, devolves upon the emperor. If it is neglected, the utter ruin of the state will follow." So what we're seeing here is politicians, like in the city of Ur, taking responsibility for feeding their citizens. And Tacitus reckoned that it cost the city 1/5 of all its revenue, and it's sucking nutrients in, if you like, from the whole of the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the North Atlantic coast. It's even importing oysters from Britain at one point. And you can also see why the defeat of Carthage was so necessary, because it would have been very awkward if some other city was vying for these supplies. And, of course, ultimately, North African soils, as I think somebody just mentioned, eventually were overfarmed, and you could effectively say Rome ate itself to death. Now, what we've been talking about here is the relationship between the feeding of cities and geography, and I just want to mention another water-based geographical power fact, as it were, which is that if we look at this rather extraordinary image of Danzig, which is called the apotheosis of Danzig, what we see, if you look closely, is an image of the River Vistula. That's the River Vistula. You can see it's absolutely enormous in terms of the scale of Europe. Now, this river was critical to feeding Europe in the early modern times because, again, as Egypt had fed Rome, the Polish and Ukrainian grain fields fed Europe. And the way the grain arrived was to go up to Danzig at the end of the river, and this is all the grain barges arriving, you can see here, and then a lot of trading was going on, and then the grain could be shipped to the rest of Europe. Now, the interesting thing about the grain, this Polish grain, is that the Dutch got very rich on it. Now, how does that work? Well, as it turns out, the Poles had a rather weird law in place which forbade Polish merchants to export Polish grain. And since the Dutch, who were sort of situated somewhere over here, were already in Danzig because they didn't have enough land, so they were already importing grain, they said, oh, don't worry, guys, we'll just bring a few more ships over and we'll sort the trade out for you. This is what's known as the mother trade, and it's why Amsterdam is such a beautiful city. Not that Danzig did badly either. But actually, if we look at this wonderful image of the dam, which was the central marketplace in Amsterdam, these are ships that have come in from Danzig. They're loaded with grain. They're going to get weighed in this kind of weighing house here. This is the city hall, which is overseeing all of this. And behind, we've got God kind of making sure everything's in order as well. This is an absolutely classic example of civic order. So we have commerce in the market space, overseen by the town hall, by civic authority, with God hovering somewhere overhead. It's exactly what the city of Ur had a couple of thousand years earlier. Now I'm coming on to the subject of my talk, as it were, having prepared you somewhat. My second quiz of the day is, here are two images. One is of Paris, one is of London, roughly the same kind of time. These are the main ports of both cities, the main river ports. So this is the Port au Blé, where the grain port, and this is London's legal quays, where all the ocean-going vessels had to show up. So just looking at those, can you immediately notice a difference between the two images? Yeah, okay, you're hot today. You're on it, exactly. Ooh. Although I have to say I have given you a few clues. Yes. So, the Thames is a navigable river, the Seine is not. And this is such a fundamental difference. I even would go as far as to say it explains Brexit. Although, of course, well, nothing explains Brexit, let's be honest. But anyway, and I'm going to explain why. So this is from this wonderful book, Stephen Kaplan's book, Provisioning Paris, where he talks about, it's longer than Lord of the Rings, this book, but it's actually so gripping you can't put it down. It's about how a city of 600,000 or 700,000 people fed itself before railways, essentially. And the answer is with extreme difficulty. So these were a series of so-called provisioning rings stretching out from the city, and the grain was extracted, sometimes willingly, but often by force, but on behalf of the city, by an enormous hierarchy of people called the grain police, who went out into the countryside and literally at musket point said, "Give us your grain, because the city needs it." And when you reckon that one harvest in 3 in the pre-industrial world failed, you can imagine this was an extremely popular policy. That was ironic in case it's too early in the morning to spot irony. Okay. So this gentleman here, Louis XVI, like kings before him, was known as the baker. So it's the thing I keep tripping. Baker of last resort. This means that he was the head of the grain police. He was held responsible for feeding the people. And he looks like the kind of guy you'd like to have feeding you, doesn't he? I mean, he looks well up for it. There's all sorts of complexity here that I don't have time, sadly, to go into, but suffice it to say that one of the key things that the grain police were very, very keen on was stopping millers baking and stopping bakers milling. Why was this? Because what they didn't want was for anyone to get what is called, in today's terminology, vertical control of the food system, i.e., if you're growing the grain and you're milling it and you're baking it, you're doing everything, so you have control. So this was forbidden. There was a black market which probably fed about a third of Paris's food, so they went round the grain police with all sorts of illegal grain deposits in monasteries. Everyone was at it. So, I mean, the thing was essentially uncontrollable. And the grain police knew this, but they just had to let it happen, because otherwise the city would have run out of food, which it periodically did. Inside the city, interestingly, what they did was they concentrated the food supply. They tried to concentrate it in one place. So here is the Port au Blé, or the Grève, which we're looking at just now, the main grain port here. It's right by the Hôtel de Ville, for obvious reasons, because obviously this is the most important thing going on in the city. And down here is the Louvre and Les Halles. And Les Halles becomes where the food trade is actually concentrated, because this becomes so hopelessly overcrowded, it's not possible. But Les Halles actually becomes a city within a city, with its own mafia-like families, its dynasties, its own clocks, its own laws, etc. It's an extraordinarily powerful place where the vast majority of Paris's food travelled through. Now, what's interesting is that when a really bad series of harvests happened because an Icelandic volcano went off in 1780, Paris started to run out of food. The king was blamed, the baker of last resort. Of course, he couldn't do anything about it because he couldn't just bring grain in from anywhere. And the market porters, les phares, went out into the streets and started agitating and saying it's the king's fault. It's him who's failing to feed you. The king, the baker of last resort, realised that things weren't looking very good. He tried to flee the city. And he was apprehended by the police, actually, because he had to just stop to change horses. But in the popular press, what was portrayed was that he was so greedy that even though he couldn't feed his people, he stopped to have an enormous meal as he was trying to save his own skin. And this is when the police come to apprehend him. And this policeman is saying, "Your Majesty, I arrest you on behalf of the people." And he's saying, rather rudely, actually, beyond the watershed, "Go away, I don't care, I'm having my dinner." And this cartoon was called Fat Birds Fly Slowly, which gives you some idea of why politicians are really keen to be in charge of the food system, if you didn't need any more evidence of why that was. Now, what comes out of this, interestingly, is the question of economics. Now, Adam Smith, I'm sure you've all heard of him, he visited Paris in the 1770s and he saw the difficulty that the city was having in feeding itself, and he met Francis de Quesnay, who was one of the leading physiocrat economists of his day, who was desperately trying to free up all of the kind of the logistics and the legalities and the medieval laws that were miring the French countryside in all of this sort of problem. And he came up with the idea of free trade. And what's very interesting, I don't think I've got time to read all these quotes out, but anyway, what was interesting was Smith said, in fact I will just read this quote out because it's very important, he compares Paris and London, and he says, "A city must derive all of its wealth and all of its subsistence from the countryside. But it's to the mutual advantage of both because the countryside and the city benefit. However, a city situated either near the seacoast or the banks of a navigable river are not necessarily confined to derive them from the country in their neighbourhood. They have a much wider range, and they may draw them from the most remote corners of the world. A city might in this manner grow to great wealth and splendour, while not only the country and its neighbourhood, but all those to which it traded, were in poverty and wretchedness." So now let's look at London, a city with a navigable river. And lo and behold, it's true that the kings and queens of England did not take responsibility for feeding the city. Au contraire, they sat in Westminster, down here, or on this map down here, and they kind of did battle with the city, which was busy doing vast amounts of trade. There were two key river ports of Queenhithe and Billingsgate. Queenhithe belonged to the Crown, Billingsgate belonged to the city, but as you can see, Queenhithe is irritatingly further upriver than Billingsgate, and there were all sorts of royal edicts issued which had very little force, saying every time a ship docks at Billingsgate, another one must dock at Queenhithe. But in fact, this didn't happen. So there's money wars going on. But another thing you'll notice about London is there is no centralised market either. In fact, the markets just naturally evolve where they would evolve. So if you think about how the food is coming into the city, the grain is coming in by river, it's stopping either at Billingsgate or Queenhithe, it's trying to make its way up to Cheapside, which is the main market, and on the way it's getting traded. So this is Bread Street, tells you what was going on. Cornhill is where it was traded in London. Fish is doing something totally different. You probably know Billingsgate was still operating on that site until 1984. Fish Street obviously tells you what was going on there. Friday Street is where you went to buy your fish on a Friday. Meat was forbidden. And of course, meat is walking into the city, so it's doing something completely different, arriving at a Smithfield outside Newgate, which then became Smithfield Market. So the point is, this is a very decentralised system. I'm worried about time.
Yeah, well, carry on.
Oh, okay. And that's so dangerous. You have no idea how dangerous that is. Woo! Right, okay, I'll hold you to... Can I have that in writing, please? So London had no problem feeding itself, which actually liberated it to do something even more interesting, and as long as you didn't happen to live on the west coast of Africa, which was to trade in all sorts of other things and to get extremely wealthy. It was part of an international, here we have Danzig again, so this is the basis of the Hanseatic League, but it's also trading all around the world. And of course, famously and horrifically, also had the brilliant idea of a sort of triangular trade route of importing slaves from West Africa, getting them to work in the sugar plantations, and then importing sugar back to London. Sugar really was... interestingly, I didn't mention with respect to the Netherlands, of course, it also had the VOC, which was the first globally international trader in things like spices from the Far East. London was very late into this game, but it caught up with sugar. So we're actually talking about now cities getting rich not just on the essentials, bread, but also on things like sugar and spices and so on, where the real money was to be made. And this is a satirical cartoon of a soldier tucking into a syllabub, which was all the rage. And people like Daniel Defoe thought this was outrageous and frivolous and a total waste of time. But of course, everyone else was too busy eating ice cream to notice. So extraordinary amounts of wealth to be had from really access to global markets, just as Smith spoke about in his book, The Wealth of Nations. Sorry, I should have said that, just in case. So what were these markets like? One thing to say is that however you fed yourself in the pre-industrial city, one thing that was good was that it was visible, and it was made visible even in London, which had a remarkably deregulated food market. Nevertheless, all the trade in meat was in open spaces like Smithfield, of course totally chaotic, when it was still a livestock market, which it was until the 1850s. And in fact, I have one more quote I have to read you from George Dodd, who wrote an amazing book called The Food of London in 1856. Do any of you know this book? An incredible book. Anyway, he's more or less summing up what Smith says. He says, "It is useless to ask by what central authority or under what controlling system is such a city as London supplied with its daily food. Nobody does it. No one, for instance, took care that a sufficient quantity of food should reach London in 1855 for the supply of 2.5 millions of human beings during 52 weeks of the year, and yet such a supply did reach London." So this is really, if you like, acknowledging the market system in full flow. And it's about to get a massive boost in the form of these things, the railways. I mean, everything I've been talking up to now has been constrained by geography, and now all of that is going to flip on its head. Of course, it's the first time you can transport food many miles and keep it fresh, and suddenly the geographical constraints go out of the window. This is the first commercial railway ever built between Liverpool and Manchester. Of course, we're also looking at industrialisation. 3 critical things happen here. The first is geography, as I say, is no longer a constraint. You can build cities pretty much anywhere, any size you like. The second thing is that visibility, which has been part of the food system, is going to disappear because food starts to travel down its own routes. And last but not least, politicians who loved feeding people, wipe their collective brows and say, thank goodness we don't have to worry about this anymore because the food companies can do it for us. So that tells its own story. That's London growing from not much bigger than its medieval size to a splurging metropolis in just 90 years after the railways come. This is what happens to Smithfield. It becomes a dead meat market. It's invisible. You're no longer allowed to just wander in here as a general member of the public. And this, of course, is what is happening to the productive hinterland. It's expanding. It's being converted from grassland, for example, in the American Midwest to grain production with the slaughter of something like its estimated 60 million animals. And in fact, what happens now is that because of this revolution in transport, grain is commodified. So no longer does Farmer Jones trundle his grain into market himself, but he takes it to a grain silo like this on a railway, and the grain arrives in Chicago where all the roads converge, and the futures market is invented. So grain is now being traded like a neutral commodity. It's the first time there's been so much grain that people couldn't eat it all anymore. So what do you do if you've got so much grain you can't eat it? Precisely right. So it's the invention of cheap meat. Again, this is the Chicago Union Stockyards. I think many of us know what a good idea that is. We've talked about it many times already this weekend. Interestingly, the meat packers complete the cycle. If you remember what the French kings were trying to stop millers and bakers doing, they do it. So they produce the animals, they process the animals, and then they complete the logistics cycle with the invention of the chill chain. So this is Swift & Company, one of the biggest meat packers, who come up with the idea of hanging blocks of ice at either end of the carriage, means they can transport fresh beef 1,000 miles, and therefore they can start flooding the East Coast cities like New York with it and undercut local butchers, etc., etc. There's a reason why the body that represents grocers in this country is called the Institute of Grocery Distribution. So the money in food, this is why Amsterdam got richer than Danzig. The money in food has never been in producing it. It's always been in moving it around. Interesting point. Deregulation. 3 countries in Europe didn't put tax embargoes on grain when American grain began to be cheaply available in Europe. And I'm not going to do the quiz thing because I think I'm probably short of time. One was Britain because we were industrialising and we needed the grain. The other 2 were Denmark and the Netherlands. They fed the grain to pigs and chickens and they exported it in the form of bacon and eggs to Britain. And that's where the great British breakfast got its big industrial boost. Of course, it was a terrible idea because this is what happened to the grasslands of the Midwest once they were farmed monoculturally with annual crops. The topsoil just basically blew away. It's the beginning of another major battle between farming organically and farming chemically. And this battle was actually, Albert Howard and co. were winning this battle. But unfortunately, the war came along. And of course, during the war, the main impetus was to create as much food as possible, as quickly as possible. And after the war, all the munitions factories that had been producing weapons and pesticides for the army were persuaded by government to transfer those onto making chemicals for the farming industry, and farmers were encouraged to farm in that way. And of course, after the war, there was this promise of a better life and a better future, and it was all to do with the food thing having been solved. So on top of the industrial system, we have consumerism. This is food that's been denatured to withstand a very, very complex logistical path. As I say, it's now going to depots and probably sort of just sitting on shelves for 3 months before you get near it. We're sold the idea of convenience in the form of cake mixes and so on. Thank you very much. Thank you. I think I can do that incredibly. No longer do we go to the middle of the city to be sociable and to meet other people and to buy our food, but we leave the city in a car. Of course, cars follows trains. This is the first ever shopping mall built in Minnesota by an Austrian architect, Victor Gruen. And of course, food is no longer following the people, it's following the money, because we now have a system where the market determines who gets to eat. And again, these are subjects we've already covered quite a lot this weekend. Power grabs. This is really the extension, if you like, of the London model, the extension of just let the market get on with it, it's really good at it, and so on. A revolving door between politicians and the food industry, and this is just one example of individuals who've both been high up in the Monsanto hierarchy and have also served in the US government. Yeah. And I did say I was going to explain Brexit, or not explain it. But I mean, what we see in Britain today is I would argue, the fully fledged version of this attitude that began because London from the beginning, was so easily able to feed itself. So this idea of regulation really never took hold in this country. And the idea of cheap food, so when all these American innovations came to Europe, we were the one country, for example, that didn't put laws in to limit out-of-town supermarket development, because this was our mindset. Our mindset was food should be cheap, easy, and it can come from anywhere. And of course, as we know, this crew have absolutely no clue how we're going to feed ourselves if we leave, crash out without a deal. Because, of course, after the war, what Europe did was it put, if you like, the French model in place, which was the EU saying we must never run out of food again, so we must protect farmers. And I forgot to say, Duquesne, so the French economist who Smith met, he said farmers were the only true wealth creators in all of society. Everyone else was just riding off the back of what they did. Anyway, and this is all about not valuing food, of course. We've created this monster called cheap food, which doesn't exist and can't exist, and we've done it by externalizing all the costs. And the world is turning into a hamburger because all the invested power is in this model, and we find it very difficult to resist this sort of food. So what are we going to do about it in the last 3.5 minutes? Well, I think what we can do is we can go back to Aristotle and his political animals, because what Aristotle also said was, it's not just about how you feed the city, but who feeds the city. He had this concept of economia. And economia basically meant household management. And the idea of that was that everybody in Athens had a house in the city and a house in the countryside, and basically their farm outside the city fed their household. And with every household basically feeding itself, the result was an independent state. And of course, this is the agro, which famously was both a political space and a food market. Now, this is an idea that really is at the basis of the wonderful Lawrence Setti I showed you. This is actually, to remind ourselves, an allegory of the effects of good government. What the city politicians are really saying is that this balance doesn't happen automatically. The city has to make it happen. That is what good government looks like, is maintaining a balance between the city and the countryside. We then look at all sorts of utopian models which echo this idea. So Plato's Republic, there's plenty of dodgy stuff going on in there as well, but we won't get into that now. But also More's Utopia, which is a critique of London, which is a series of semi-independent city-states. Ebenezer Hower's Cities, Garden Cities of Tomorrow, which is basically Thomas More with railways. It really is actually. The basic idea here is that the city, so what the really important idea here is that the people who constitute the city are responsible also for feeding themselves. It's not a question of, oh, somebody else is going to do it for me, nobody does it, as George Doss said. We actually have to take responsibility. This is my word that I've made for understanding the importance of food. It just means Utopia. It's an alternative to Utopia, actually. If you like Utopia seen through the lens of food, it just means food place. It just acknowledges how powerfully our lives are shaped by food. But it also suggests that if we understand the true value of food as the most important thing in our lives, we can shape the world a lot better. This is what the food system looks like at the moment. It's a monopoly. We need a food system that looks like this, which is democratic. This is what the food movement actually does. It joins the roots, the producers, to the branches. It's Carlo Petrini's idea of co-producing. The idea that you don't just sit there as a passive consumer, but you actively go out and meet the people producing your food, whether through community supported agriculture, food co-ops, growing communities, and so on. It's about making space for food in the city, because if you want lots of people to feed you... I know, really, really quick. Making space for food in the city, incorporating food in the way we think about cities, joining the countryside to the land. I can tell you about this at tea, if we have time outside. And my last slide. Just basically to say, what can we learn from this interesting comparison of Paris and London? What we learn is that neither model is right. We can't control food. It's uncontrollable. We need markets. On the other hand, we can't just leave it to the market either. That way dystopia lies. So Paris and London need to get together in a kind of nice entente cordiale and work out a way how food and power can come together so that it serves the people and serves democracy and makes a better society. Thank you very much.